The general store door swung shut in Lena's face, the iron latch clicking with a finality that sounded, in the howling dark of the Yukon afternoon, exactly like a coffin lid. She stood on the frozen boardwalk and breathed. The air was so cold it burned going down, settling in her lungs like swallowed glass, the thermometer nailed to the post outside. The trading post read -31. She hadn't needed to look at it. She could feel -31 in the cartilage of her ears and the exposed skin between her scarf and her hat brim, the few centimeters of flesh that the wind found immediately and began working on with quiet, methodical cruelty. The truck was gone. She knew it would be. She'd known it the moment she stepped off the supply bus in Fallow Creek and saw the parking lot empty except for 2 snow machines and an old man's rusted Silverado. She'd told herself she was wrong. She'd stood in front of the store for 20 minutes in the dark and the driving snow, telling herself she was wrong, until the store owner came out and told her, not unkindly, that he was closing, and she needed to move along. The truck was gone. Raylan was gone, and her wallet, her phone, and her duffel bag had all been on the passenger seat of that truck. She had $19 in the breast pocket of her coat. She had her work gloves, her hat, her scarf, and a thermos that had been empty since noon. She had the clothes on her back, in Fallow Creek, in the Yukon, in February, with the temperature dropping and a forecast that used the word severe 3 separate times. That was almost nothing. Lena pressed her back against the rough log wall of the general store and breathed and tried to think. There was a lodge 2 kilometers north. The bus driver had mentioned it in passing. Maybe. They had a room. $19 would not cover a room. Maybe they'd let her use a phone. She could call. She ran through the list and arrived, with a cold thud of clarity, at the same answer she always arrived at. There was no one to call. Her sister lived in Halifax. Her mother didn't pick up after 8. The friends she'd had before Raylan had quietly, steadily, been replaced by Raylan himself. The way a weed replaces a garden, one season at a time. She needed to move. Standing still was how you died out here. She knew that much. She pushed off the wall and started walking. The snow was coming down sideways by the time she heard the horses. Not horses. One horse, and behind it the creak and groan of a wooden sled, the kind that loggers still used in the back country. It came out of the dark the way a ship materializes out of fog. Gradually, and then all at once. The horse was a massive grey Percheron, blowing great clouds of steam into the night air, its coat white with frost along the neck and shoulders. Behind it, loaded high with split wood and lashed down with heavy rope, was a wide sled with iron runners. Standing on the back runners, handling the reins with the ease of someone doing nothing more remarkable than walking to the mailbox, was the biggest man Lena had ever seen. He pulled the horse up without drama. The Percheron stopped, tossed its head once, and stood. The man looked at her. He didn't say anything. He had a beard that had been going since autumn, ice crystals caught in the dark brown of it, and his eyes, what she could see of them beneath the brim of a battered canvas hat, were a dark, steady grey. He wore a heavy Mackinaw jacket, the color of old charcoal, and his work gloves were the size of catcher's mitts. He looked at her the way a man who has lived alone in the bush for a long time looks at unexpected things, with careful, unhurried assessment. No alarm, no warmth. She waited for him to ask if she was all right. He didn't. He looked at her thermos, her frozen scarf, the rigid way she was holding her shoulders against the cold. Then he looked at the road ahead of him, and then back at her. "Store's closed," he said. His voice was exactly what you'd expect from a man that size, low and flat, with very little flex in it. "I know," Lena said. He unwrapped the reins from the brake post and didn't move to go. He just sat there on the back of that sled while the snow fell between them. "You got somewhere to be?" The question was blunt enough to be almost rude. She considered, lying. She was very tired. "No," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. "Road north's drifting over," he said. "Lodge'll be dark by now anyway." He didn't say anything else. He reached under the seat, pulled out a folded wool blanket stiff with cold, and tossed it onto the sled deck. It was not an invitation, it was closer to a logistical statement. Here is a blanket, here is the sled. The arithmetic was hers to do. Lena did the arithmetic. She thought of the road and the dark and the 31 below. She thought of Raylan's truck disappearing south. She thought of the thermos, empty since noon. She climbed onto the sled. The man said nothing. He clicked his tongue at the horse and they moved. She didn't know how long they rode, long enough for the cold to stop being a sensation and start being a fact, a permanent condition, the new normal. She wrapped the blanket around herself and tucked her hands under her arms and watched the trees come in close on both sides of the trail, black spruce packed so tight that the headlamp on the front of the sled made a narrow tunnel of yellow light, and everything beyond it was absolute dark. His name was Vern. She found that out later. On the sled, he said nothing. At all. Gradually. Then all at once. Gradually. Then a low, wide building with a steeply pitched roof, dark timber walls, a stone chimney pushing out a thick stream of smoke that the wind immediately tore apart. A squared log barn stood a short distance away, connected to the cabin by a covered walkway. The yard had been shoveled clear sometime that afternoon. 2 dogs appeared from the direction of the barn, tails moving in a controlled, businesslike way. Vern pulled the horse up at the barn end of the walkway. He got down, unlatched the barn door, and led the Percheron inside without looking back. He didn't tell her to get down, but he didn't help her either. She climbed off the sled herself. Her legs went immediately. She grabbed the sled rail, pulled herself upright, and stood there breathing hard, while her frozen muscles argued with the instructions she was sending them. One of the dogs pushed its nose against the back of her hand. It was warm and wet and startling. She gripped the fur at its neck and straightened herself. Vern came back out of the barn. He looked at her, standing there, one hand on the dog, not quite upright. He made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite a sigh, wasn't quite a word, just a heavy breath of acknowledgement, and crossed the yard to her. He didn't carry her. He put one hand under her elbow and walked her up the steps and through the cabin door, and the grip was absolutely businesslike, exactly the way you'd guide a person who is unsteady on their feet and likely to become a problem if they fall. Inside was dim and warm. The stove in the corner was going, and the air smelled of wood smoke, black tea, and something dark and resinous that she couldn't place. Vern guided her to a chair beside the stove and took his hand away. "Boots off," he said. She tried. Her fingers were clumsy, and her feet were not cooperating with any part of the project. Vern stood watching for a moment, and then he dropped to one knee and knocked her hands aside and worked the laces himself. They were frozen, nearly solid. He picked at them with the blunt, patient precision of a man who has untied 100 frozen knots and is not surprised by any of them. He pulled her boots off one at a time, set them near the stove but not too close, and pulled off her wool socks with the same brisk efficiency. He looked at her feet. Then he looked up at her. "Don't put them near the heat yet," he said. "Cold flush first, then warm. Other way around and it'll feel like your feet are on fire." He stood, walked to the kitchen counter, and filled a metal basin with cold water. He set it on the floor in front of her chair, and she lowered her feet into it, and sat very still, with her teeth clenched, breathing. He put the kettle on. He didn't offer to talk. He moved around the cabin the way a man moves in a space that is entirely his own, without self-consciousness, with very little wasted motion. He pulled off his own coat and gloves, and hung them on the hooks by the door. He fed the stove. He set 2 mugs on the counter and spooned tea into a dented pot. He pulled a cast-iron pan from the hook above the stove and set it on the element, and the smell of cold butter hitting hot iron cut right through the wood smoke. Lena sat with her feet in the basin and watched him cook. She was looking for it. She'd been looking for it since the moment she climbed onto that sled, the thing men always had, the angle, the cost, the shape of the transaction. She catalogued it the way you catalogue weather when you live in a country that can kill you. Automatically, constantly, because the failure to notice was the failure to survive. Her father had wanted compliance. The two men before Raylan had wanted versions of themselves reflected back. Raylan had wanted, in the end, something she had no clean word for. Just the slow, grinding erasure of everything about her that made him feel uncertain. Vern wanted nothing that she could see. He cracked 4 eggs into the pan and didn't look at her. The tea appeared first, on the flat arm of the chair. It was strong, nearly black, and it was in a mug that had seen better decades. She wrapped both hands around it and drank, and it hit her empty stomach, like a coal being dropped into cold water. The eggs came on a plate with 2 pieces of dense, dark bread, toasted on the stove grate and spread with something yellow and plain. He handed the plate to her, took his own to the wooden chair on the other side of the stove, and ate without comment. Lena ate. She tried to be careful about it. She managed about 90 seconds of careful before the warmth hit her bloodstream and her body broke over completely, and she ate the rest of it the way a person eats when they haven't had food since 7 in the morning, and it is now well past dark, and they are past the point of caring what they look like. She mopped the plate with the last piece of bread she held, the mug with both hands, and looked up. Vern was watching her. He was holding his own plate on his knee, not quite finished, and he was watching her with those flat grey eyes that held no judgment, and no warmth, and no amusement, just attention. "Sorry," she said, her face hot despite everything. He shook his head once. "Small, don't be." He stood and took both plates to the counter. "You'd have passed out in another hour out there." She didn't say anything. She looked at the floor. "Where were you headed?" She considered the question. It had several true answers, and none of them were good. "Away," she said finally. Vern set the plates in the enamel basin, turned on the tap for a moment, turned it off. Away from what? It wasn't really a question. It was a space he was leaving open, like a door held ajar. She didn't have to walk through it. "Someone," she said. He didn't respond. He came back to his chair and picked up a piece of leather work from the floor beside it. A harness strap, she saw, with a buckle that had torn free. He threaded a heavy needle and went to work on it in silence. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had found a new pitch, a low shuddering moan in the eaves. Lena pulled her feet out of the basin and curled them under her on the chair, tucking the hem of her coat over them. "There's a cot in the back room," Vern said, not looking up from the leather. "Sheets are in the chest at the foot of it. Stove won't need feeding until 4. She stared at him. He kept his eyes on the harness. "I split the wood. I'll need it stacked by the barn before the next storm. 2 days, maybe 3. He bit through the thread. "That's if you're staying." "I don't have money," Lena said. "Didn't ask for money. I don't." She stopped. "I don't know you." He looked up then. His grey eyes met hers and held them for a moment that was neither long nor short, just steady. "No," he said. "You don't." He went back to the leather. Cots in the back room. She slept in her clothes, under a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and cold air. And she slept without dreaming for the first time in longer than she could account for. And when she woke, there was pale grey light coming through the one small window and the sound of an axe striking wood in a steady, unhurried rhythm somewhere outside. She found the cot was made of birch poles, and the mattress was ticking, stuffed with something that had compacted over time into something not quite comfortable and not quite unbearable. She found the stove in the back room. Had gone cold in the night. She found a pair of wool socks folded on top of the chest at the foot of the cot, thick grey ones, new enough that they still had the store's rubber band around them. She sat for a moment with the socks in her hands. Then she put them on. The main room was empty. The fire in the big stove was going. There was coffee in the pot on the back element, dark and ferocious. She poured a mug and drank it standing at the window, looking out at the yard. Vern was at the chopping block. He split wood the way he did everything else, with absolute economy, the axe coming down in the same place every time, the rounds falling in 2 clean halves. He didn't look up. She went and stacked it. He didn't comment on this. He split, she stacked, and they worked in a silence that was different from the silence of the truck cab with Raylan, which had been a weapon. This was just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that existed because nothing needed to be said. The storm hit on the 2nd day. It came without announcement, the sky simply dropping from pale grey to white to absolute zero visibility. In the time it took Lena to carry 2 loads of wood from the pile to the covered walkway, Vern appeared at her shoulder out of nowhere, took the armload from her, and jerked his head toward the cabin side, he said. That was all. The storm kept them there for 4 days. On the 1st day she learned the stove, its rhythms and its moods, how much wood it wanted, and when and what it sounded like when it was happy. On the 2nd day she asked Vern with some difficulty where he kept his flour, because she could see sourdough starter in a jar on the shelf, and it seemed wasteful to leave it. He looked at her for a moment and then pointed at the lower cupboard. He didn't say anything, but he put down the trap he'd been mending and came to stand at her shoulder, while she measured, not helping, just present, and when the dough came together, he made a sound low in his throat that she was learning to recognize as the equivalent of a nod. On the 3rd day, the wind found a crack in the mud, chinking above the north window, and the temperature in the corner of the cabin where she'd moved. Her things dropped 10 degrees in an hour. Vern appeared with a tin of chinking compound and a putty knife, worked the crack for 20 minutes, and was gone again, before she'd finished, asking if she could help. On the 4th day she was cutting onions at the counter, and she knocked the heavy cast-iron pot off the hook above the stove. It hit the floor with a sound like a cannon going off. She flinched back hard, her heart hammering, her hands coming up in a way that she recognized, even as she was doing it, as the posture of someone braced for a response to the noise. Vern was across the room in 3 steps. He didn't yell. He looked at the pot on the floor, looked at her hands still raised in front of her, and went very still. He picked up the pot. He set it on the counter. He pulled a stool out from under the counter and set it beside her. "Sit down," he said quietly. He turned back to the stove, adjusted the damper, took the cutting board with the onions and resumed the job himself. She sat on the stool and watched his hands on the knife, slow and steady, and her heartbeat came down. Slowly, the way a spooked animal comes down when it finally confirms that the threat is not here, not in this room, not from this source. He slid the onions into the pot. He didn't mention her hands. That evening he put another log on the fire and sat down across from her with a mug of tea and looked at her for a long moment. Without speaking, "You're afraid of loud sounds," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't gentle, and it was also not unkind. It was the tone of a man stating a thing that has been observed and deserves to be acknowledged. Lena held her mug. Outside the storm moaned in the spruce. "I used to not be," she said. Vern drank his tea. "How long?" 2 years. She looked at the fire. A bit more. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say "that's terrible" or "you poor thing" or any of the things that required her to manage his response to her pain. He turned his mug in his hands and watched the fire. "Bear caught me in the creek bottom 3 years ago," he said. "Dog flushed her before I heard her coming. She got my shoulder and my back before I could get the rifle up." He reached back without looking, tapped 2 fingers against the upper right of his back, below the shoulder blade. "Took the better part of a year, before I stopped looking up every time something moved at the edge of my vision." Lena looked at him. His face was turned toward the fire, and he wasn't looking at her. "What happened to the bear?" she asked. He glanced at her then. "Rifle worked." She almost smiled. It surprised her so much that she didn't. Quite. He drank his tea. "You carry it differently than you did 3 days ago," he said. "Still there, but different." She thought about that. She thought about stacking the wood in the cold morning while he split, and the bread she'd made yesterday that had come out denser than she'd wanted. but that he'd eaten without comment 2 slices and asked no questions about her process. She thought about the socks on the chest at the foot of the cot. "It's quieter here than I'm used to," she said. "That's generally the idea." The storm broke overnight. She woke to the sound of nothing. No wind, no rattling eaves, just the deep crystalline silence of a Yukon morning after snowfall. The light coming through the window was extraordinary. She lay in the cot under the wool blanket and looked at the ceiling and breathed. She felt the dread arrive about 10 minutes later. It came the way it always came, patient and inevitable, the morning tax. The road would be opening. The world was resuming, and she had $19, and no phone and no plan and no particular destination, and Raylan was somewhere south of here in a truck that had her things in it. She dressed. She made coffee. She stood at the window while Vern went out to tend to the horse and the dogs, and she watched the cleared yard and the blue-white morning and tried to think. She heard him come back in. She didn't turn around. "Road'll be passable by afternoon," he said. He hung up his coat. She could hear him at the stove. "Supply truck runs tomorrow morning." Lena stared at the window. She kept her back straight. She had gotten very good at keeping her back straight. "I'll get out of your way," she said. "I can sleep at the—" She stopped. She didn't actually know if there was a bus station somewhere in town. Vern was quiet for a moment. She could hear the scrape of the pan. "You could," he said. His voice was exactly as flat as it always was, the same texture as the creek gravel, unhurried, not reaching for anything. "Or you could stay till spring and help me get the wood in for next winter. I've been a man short since September." She turned around. He was at the stove, not looking at her, managing the bacon in the pan. "I'm not," she said, and stopped. He glanced over his shoulder. "Not what?" "A man." She wasn't sure what she meant by that. She meant something about competence, about the category of help he needed, about the gap between what she was and what the work required. She meant, "I dropped your pot, and I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm afraid of loud sounds." He turned back to the pan. "I know that," he said. "Wood still needs stacking." She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. She thought about the bread that had been too dense and he'd eaten without complaint. She thought about his hands on the frozen laces of her boots. She thought about him sitting in the dark across from her and saying, "You carry it differently than you did 3 days ago." Like that was something worth noticing. "I'd need to call my sister," Lena said. "Let her know I'm a wall," Vern said. He did not turn around. "And always has been." She looked. There was, in fact, a phone on the wall, a landline, yellow plastic, probably older than she was. She hadn't seen it. She hadn't looked. She stood at the window one more moment, watching the blue-white morning, the clean, untracked snow in the yard. It looked like a page that hadn't been written on yet. She walked to the wall and picked up the phone. Vern kept his eyes on the pan. The bacon crackled in the quiet. Outside, the dogs were moving around the yard, their breath coming in, small quick plumes, their tracks the first marks in the new snow.